Clutching forgotten Kentucky meadows, the morning mist still clings to the rolling hills where the crumbling remains of what was once Pleasant Hill stand, a Shaker community that vanished overnight in 1834. Without a trace, over 300 souls simply disappeared, leaving behind only empty buildings and a silence so profound that locals still refuse to walk those grounds after dark. Buried in archives that few are brave enough to examine, the state of Kentucky has kept the official records sealed for nearly 2 centuries. But a truth so horrifying that it challenges everything we thought we knew about America's religious communities has been revealed by recently uncovered testimonies from a visiting Ohio inspector. What happened at Pleasant Hill wasn't just a tragedy. Disguised as holy devotion, it was 27 years of systematic terror. Before we uncover the dark truth that authorities tried so desperately to hide, I need to ask something of you. For everyone, this channel isn't. Only for those brave enough to face the darkest corners of American history is it intended. If you're one of the select few who seeks these hidden truths, hit that subscribe button and let me know in the comments what state you're listening from. Now, let's step back in time to discover how a family's greed transformed a sacred community into something far more sinister. Orchestrated by a family whose corruption ran deeper than anyone could imagine, what began in 1807 as a beacon of spiritual purity would become one of Kentucky's most carefully concealed secrets. Sweeping across Kentucky like wildfire, the year was 1807, and the Second Great Awakening was. In this atmosphere of religious fervor, Pleasant Hill emerged as a sanctuary for those seeking to live according to Shaker principles: celibacy, communal property, and separation from the world's corruption. Willingly surrendering their earthly possessions for the promise of spiritual perfection, the community nestled in the fertile Bluegrass region near Harrodsburg attracted hundreds of converts. Permeating every aspect of daily life, at the heart of this seemingly devout community stood the Richardson family. Claiming direct ordination from Mother and Lee's original disciples, Elder Samuel Richardson, a tall man with piercing gray eyes and a voice that could command any congregation, had arrived from Ohio. Convincing even skeptical visitors of his authenticity was his carefully maintained appearance, always dressed in simple but immaculate Shaker garb, and his encyclopedic knowledge of Shaker theology. Publicly renouncing their marriage to maintain Shaker celibacy while secretly continuing their relationship in the privacy of Samuel's expanded quarters was his wife, Sister Martha Richardson. A skill she used to devastating effect in managing the community's complex social dynamics, Martha possessed an almost supernatural ability to read people's motivations and fears. Masking a calculating intelligence that rivals found both intimidating and irresistible was her soft-spoken manner and gentle smile. Throughout the community, like the roots of an ancient oak, their family network extended. Managing the community's extensive agricultural operations was their eldest son, Brother Ezekiel Richardson, a broad-shouldered man with his father's commanding presence. Supplying produce markets throughout the Ohio River Valley, he had transformed Pleasant Hill's farming from subsistence agriculture into a commercial enterprise. Serving as the community's unofficial security chief was his younger brother, Brother Caleb Richardson, monitoring members' private conversations and correspondence with an efficiency that would have impressed any modern intelligence operation. Overseeing the women's dormitories and new convert orientation was Sister Rebecca Richardson, Samuel and Martha's eldest daughter. Channeling what observers described as fierce maternal instincts into managing the female members of the community, at 28, she had never married. Legendary among those who survived her spiritual counseling sessions was her ability to break down psychological defenses and rebuild personalities according to Richardson family specifications. Maintaining the community's official records and correspondence was the youngest Richardson daughter, Sister Patience. Allowing her to craft convincing letters in any handwriting style, despite being only 24, she possessed a gift for forgery. Creating the documentary facade that protected the family's operations from outside scrutiny was her meticulous record-keeping after studying a person's writing for just a few days. Controlling the community's profitable furniture workshops was Samuel's brother, Brother Jeremiah Richardson. A master craftsman who had learned woodworking before the family's corruption began, Jeremiah maintained the quality standards that made Pleasant Hill furniture sought after throughout Kentucky and beyond. Employing nearly 50 community members in what appeared to be dignified craftsmanship, but functioned more like a forced labor operation, were his workshops. Managing their lucrative seed business that supplied farms across 3 states was Brother Isaiah Richardson, Samuel's cousin. Providing perfect cover for activities that would have horrified his business partners were Isaiah's monthly travels to distant customers. Making him welcome at farms from Ohio to Tennessee, where his true purposes remained carefully hidden, was his gentle demeanor and obvious expertise in agricultural matters. Supervising the community's kitchens and food distribution was Martha's sister, Sister Hannah Collins. Allowing the family to reward compliance and punish dissent in ways that appeared natural to outside observers was her control over nutrition. Knowledge she applied with scientific precision to manage the community's psychological and physical health. Hannah had studied the effects of various herbs and substances, playing crucial roles, even the extended family. Serving as a living symbol of the community's supposed spiritual authenticity was Samuel's elderly mother, Mother Sarah Richardson. Lending credibility to Samuel's claims of long-standing Shaker connections, while her apparent frailty made her an unlikely suspect in any wrongdoing, was her presence. Guiding their long-term planning, in reality, Mother Sarah was the family's strategic mastermind whose decades of experience in manipulation. Managing the community's external relationships with local authorities and neighboring communities was Brother Nathan Richardson, Samuel's youngest brother. Convincing Sheriff William Morrison of Mercer County that Pleasant Hill was a model religious community deserving protection and support was his charm and apparent sincerity. Proving invaluable when questions arose about the community's activities were Nathan's regular donations to local churches and civic organizations that purchased goodwill. Throughout Kentucky and beyond, the community's reputation spread. Constructed with materials purchased through the community's legitimate business profits, visitors marveled at the pristine buildings. Producing vegetables and herbs that supplied both the community's needs and commercial markets were the perfectly ordered gardens maintained by members who worked from dawn to dusk. Impressing even skeptical observers who saw no obvious signs of coercion or abuse was the apparent contentment of the nearly 400 members. The intricate web of surveillance and control the Richardson family had woven throughout Pleasant Hill was what outsiders couldn't perceive. Flowing through family members who reported directly to Samuel and Martha during their nightly strategy sessions was every aspect of community life. Occurring without Richardson approval was no decision, no matter how trivial. Requiring detailed justification and careful supervision, no member could leave the grounds without a Richardson family escort, and even brief trips to nearby Harrodsburg. What modern psychologists would recognize as a perfect totalitarian environment was what the family had created. Flowing only downward from the leadership was information, while surveillance ensured that any dissent was quickly identified and addressed. Making resistance seem not just futile, but unthinkable to most members was the community's isolation, both geographical and psychological. Stripping away their previous identities and rebuilding their personalities according to Richardson specifications, new converts underwent a carefully designed indoctrination process. Supervised primarily by Rebecca and Martha Richardson, this process typically took 6 months to complete. Psychologically transformed into compliant followers who viewed questioning the family's authority as tantamount to questioning God himself, by its conclusion, new members had been. Reinforcing this control at every turn was the community's daily routine. To the sound of Brother Caleb's bell, members rose at 4:30 each morning, ate breakfast prepared under Hannah Collins's supervision, and spent their days at assigned tasks that had been carefully designed to prevent private conversations or independent thinking. Combining genuine spiritual elements with subtle psychological manipulation that reinforced dependency and discouraged critical thinking were evening worship services led by Samuel Richardson with various family members playing supporting roles. On a frigid February morning in 1812, the first crack in Pleasant Hill's perfect facade appeared when Brother Thomas Whitman, a successful merchant who had donated his entire estate to the community 5 years earlier, began asking uncomfortable questions about the community's finances during a public meeting. As one of the community's earliest and most generous converts, Brother Thomas had arrived at Pleasant Hill in 1807. Whose children had died in a cholera outbreak, a widower in his 50s had found comfort in the Shaker promise of spiritual family and eternal purpose. Providing much of the capital that allowed the Richardson family to establish their operations on such a grand scale was his donation of a thriving dry goods business and substantial property holdings. For 5 years, the model community member had been Thomas. He worked tirelessly in Brother Ezekiel's agricultural operations, served as a mentor to younger converts, and never questioned the leadership's decisions. Impressing visitors and reinforcing the community's reputation for spiritual authenticity was his transformation from successful businessman to humble Shaker brother. Making him uniquely qualified to notice discrepancies that escaped other members' attention was Thomas's business background. Gradually revealing inconsistencies that troubled his conscience was his trained eye for financial details combined with his access to certain operational records through his agricultural work. Didn't match the amounts Thomas had observed during his visits to customer farms were the seed business profits reported by Brother Isaiah. Given the number of pieces he saw being produced, the furniture workshop revenue seemed impossibly high. Most puzzling of all, didn't align with the consumption records he maintained for feed and supplies were the community's membership numbers. His weathered hands holding several pages of carefully calculated figures, brothers and sisters, Thomas stood during the monthly community meeting. I've been praying about some concerns that weigh heavy on my heart. Our blessed community has prospered beyond measure. Yet I see contradictions in our records that trouble my soul. Lasting mere seconds but communicating volumes, the silence that followed was deafening. Around the packed meeting hall, Richardson family members exchanged glances. His hands folded peacefully in his lap, Samuel Richardson's face remained serene. But those who knew him well noticed the subtle tightening around his eyes. Yet her knuckles whitened as she gripped her prayer book with increasing pressure. Sister Martha's gentle smile never wavered. His voice gaining strength as he warmed to his topic, the seed business, Thomas continued. Brother Isaiah reported profits of $800 from Ohio customers last quarter. But when I delivered supplies to those same farms, I calculated sales that should have generated nearly $1,200. Where has this missing money gone? Ostensibly to check the room's temperature, but his movement positioned him between Thomas and the exit, Brother Caleb Richardson rose from his seat near the door. Cataloging every expression and gesture for later analysis, Sister Rebecca's eyes never left Thomas's face. Creating an almost imperceptible web of surveillance and control, around the room, other Richardson family members made subtle adjustments to their positions. Apparently oblivious to the dangerous territory he was entering, furthermore, Thomas pressed on. Our membership rolls show 400 souls, yet our food consumption suggests we're feeding barely 250. Brother Jeremiah's furniture workshops claim to employ 50 members, but I count only 37 who regularly report for that duty. These numbers don't reconcile. And as stewards of God's bounty, shouldn't we demand accuracy in our accounting? Mixing gentle correction with unmistakable warning, the response came not from Samuel, but from Mother Sarah Richardson, whose elderly voice carried surprising authority across the silent hall. Brother Thomas, she said, her tone. Your concerns show a heart still attached to worldly thinking. In our blessed community, we trust that our leaders, guided by divine wisdom, manage all temporal matters for our spiritual benefit. Perhaps you need time for prayer and reflection to overcome these doubts that trouble your faith. His expression radiating paternal concern for a wayward child, Samuel Richardson nodded gravely. Brother Thomas, your dedication to our community's welfare touches my heart deeply. But perhaps your mind has been clouded by memories of your former worldly life. Sister Hannah, would you prepare Brother Thomas some of your special chamomile tea? I believe he needs rest and reflection to clear his thoughts of these troubling concerns. For another hour, the meeting continued, but Thomas Whitman's questions had fundamentally altered the atmosphere. Suddenly finding urgent reasons to examine their prayer books or adjust their clothing, other members avoided eye contact with him. Carrying an underlying tension that hadn't existed before Thomas's intervention were the Richardson family's responses to subsequent business items. In his dormitory bed by Sister Rebecca, who discovered the body during her routine evening inspection of the men's quarters, that evening, Thomas was found dead. Painting a picture of peaceful transition was her tearful announcement to the gathered community. Brother Thomas passed gently in his sleep, called home by the Lord after confessing his sin of doubt during evening prayers. His last words were an apology for allowing worldly concerns to cloud his spiritual vision. With the resigned faith they'd been conditioned to embrace, the community accepted this explanation. After all, tantamount to questioning God's will was questioning the leadership's account of events. Becoming a lesson about the dangers of allowing business concerns to interfere with spiritual submission was Brother Thomas's funeral the following day. Who cleaned the dormitories each morning, but young Sister Mary Caldwell noticed details that would haunt her for decades. She was struck by the bitter almond smell that lingered despite the room's windows being open all night when she entered Thomas's room to prepare it for cleaning. that she'd never seen on any corpse, including her own grandfather, who had died peacefully at home. Thomas's fingernails had turned a distinct blue color, that Sister Rebecca had carefully wiped away before calling for help. Most disturbing of all, she discovered traces of white foam around Thomas's mouth, including the financial calculations that had started the crisis. Mary watched in growing horror as Brother Caleb Richardson collected all of Thomas's personal papers. During what Samuel Richardson described as a cleansing ceremony to purge worldly attachments from our sacred space, these documents, along with Thomas's ledger books and correspondence, were burned in the communal fireplace that very night. How thoroughly the Richardsons controlled information flow and emotional responses was revealed by the community's reaction, where members confessed their own doubts and worldly thoughts, creating an atmosphere where questioning leadership became synonymous with spiritual failure. Within hours of Thomas's death, Sister Martha was leading prayer circles, leaving no time for private conversations or independent reflection. Brother Ezekiel organized intensive work details that kept potential questioners busy from dawn to dusk. Using Thomas as a cautionary tale of what happened when faith wavered and worldly concerns corrupted pure hearts, Brother Jeremiah led evening discussions about the dangers of challenging spiritual authority, serving the dual purpose of preventing future dissent while identifying members whose responses suggested they might harbor similar doubts. These sessions, which became a regular feature of community life, served. How quickly Thomas Whitman's memory was systematically erased was the most chilling aspect of the community's response. His personal belongings were redistributed within days, his work assignments transferred to other members, and his name removed from community records except for a brief death notice within a month. His questions forgotten and his concerns dismissed as the ravings of a mind corrupted by worldly attachment. It was as if Brother Thomas had never existed at all. That would continue for over 2 decades, growing more sophisticated and ruthless with each iteration. In the months following Thomas Whitman's death, a pattern began to emerge. Began experiencing what the Richardsons termed spiritual crisis, requiring special intervention were members who asked probing questions about finances, who expressed desire to visit family outside the community, or who showed signs of wanting to leave Pleasant Hill. For handling dissent, Brother Jeremiah Richardson developed what became known as the retreat system. They would be assigned to special prayer and fasting retreats in isolated cabins scattered across the community's extensive property when someone questioned community practices or showed signs of independence. Presented as opportunities for troubled souls to reconnect with divine purpose through solitude and meditation, these retreats, always supervised by various Richardson family members, were, while serving their true purpose as holding facilities, the retreat cabins constructed under Brother Jeremiah's direction in remote corners of the community's thousands of acres were designed to appear rustic and spiritual. Containing a single room with basic furniture, heavy wooden shutters that could be barred from outside, and doors that locked only from the exterior was each cabin. Ensuring that any sounds from within would never reach other members were the cabin's isolated locations connected to the main community only by narrow paths through dense woods. Identifying retreat candidates, Brother Caleb Richardson managed the logistics of reported private conversations, observed relationships, and monitored correspondence for signs of disloyalty or independent thinking was his network of informants throughout the community. Attributing chance encounters with Caleb to coincidence rather than systematic surveillance, his methods were so subtle that most members never realized they were being watched. Followed carefully developed criteria, the selection process for retreats were prime candidates, as were longer-term members who showed signs of developing leadership potential that might threaten Richardson authority, recent converts who asked too many questions about absent family members. Also found themselves selected for spiritual intervention were members who demonstrated excessive attachment to possessions they had donated, who expressed homesickness during community meetings, or who formed close friendships that might enable organized resistance. Ensuring that worried family members received carefully crafted letters explaining their loved ones' sudden departures or deaths, Sister Hannah Collins managed the community's correspondence with remarkable sophistication. And she had studied each member's writing style with scientific precision, enabling her to forge convincing final letters that would satisfy distant relatives for years to come. Her penmanship was flawless. Requiring extensive preparation and planning was Hannah's forgery operation. Including samples of their handwriting, information about distant relatives, and knowledge of their pre-conversion lives that could be referenced in false correspondence, she maintained detailed files on each community member's background. Hannah would prepare multiple letters to be sent over several months, creating the illusion of an ongoing correspondence that gradually explained the person's absence when someone was selected for elimination. Describing spiritual revelations that called them to missionary work in untamed Western territories, parents in Ohio received touching notes from children they would never see again. Complete with descriptions of final words and burial ceremonies that never occurred, siblings in Pennsylvania got detailed accounts of peaceful deaths following brief illnesses. Designed to provide closure while discouraging further inquiry, the letters were masterpieces of emotional manipulation. Providing perfect cover for disposing of evidence and maintaining the community's external relationships was Brother Isaiah Richardson's seed business. While simultaneously conducting legitimate business that reinforced his reputation as a trustworthy merchant and devout Shaker brother, his monthly trips to distant farms offered opportunities to bury bodies in remote locations across Kentucky, Ohio, and Tennessee. To serve multiple purposes were Isaiah's routes. While his knowledge of remote farm properties gained through years of business relationships enabled him to identify burial sites that would never be discovered, his legitimate customers provided alibis for his presence in distant locations, who welcomed his visits and never questioned his occasional requests to camp overnight on their property during bad weather. He developed relationships with isolated farmers. Methodical and efficient was the disposal process. That appeared to contain normal agricultural supplies but included hidden compartments designed for their grisly cargo. Bodies were transported in specially modified seed wagons. Meant that his overnight absences during trips were never questioned by customers who assumed he was maintaining his demanding schedule. Was Isaiah's reputation for punctuality and reliability. When they occasionally inquired about missing persons, local authorities were shown immaculate records maintained by Sister Patience Richardson, demonstrating through carefully crafted paperwork that individuals had left voluntarily for other communities or had died of natural causes with proper burial in the community cemetery. Her documentation system was a marvel of bureaucratic deception. Far beyond simple membership logs, Patience's record-keeping extended. That could explain sudden deaths from natural causes, travel documentation that supported claims about members departing for distant communities, and correspondence files that included both genuine letters and Hannah's forgeries. She maintained detailed medical histories, ensured that any official inquiry could be answered with convincing documentation that withstood casual scrutiny. Were her organizational skills. Perhaps more chilling than their physical crimes was the psychological control the Richardson family maintained. Where questioning authority was equated with spiritual failure, where blind obedience was the highest virtue, and where members policed each other's thoughts and behaviors, they had created a closed system. They had been transformed into unwitting accomplices in their own oppression. The remaining community members weren't just victims. At around 400 members, despite the constant stream of new converts arriving monthly and the mysterious disappearances that occurred with increasing frequency, the community's population remained steady. Through what Brother Caleb privately called natural selection, this stability was maintained, balanced by aggressive recruitment of new converts whose property donations financed the operation's expansion. Was the systematic removal of anyone who posed a threat to family control, who had developed sophisticated methods for identifying potential troublemakers before they could influence other members. New arrivals were carefully screened by the Richardson women, actually served to assess each convert's psychological profile, family connections, and potential value to the community. Were Sister Rebecca's intake interviews conducted under the guise of spiritual counseling, underwent intensive indoctrination designed to strip away their previous identities. Where those deemed dangerous were marked for early elimination, while valuable converts combined genuine spiritual elements with systematic psychological abuse that created trauma bonds between victims and their abusers. The indoctrination process refined over years of practice, while being subjected to alternating periods of intense attention and deliberate neglect that broke down their psychological defenses and made them desperate for approval from community leaders. New converts were isolated from contact with the outside world. Pleasant Hill operated like a well-oiled machine of exploitation by 1825. Working together with mechanical precision that would have impressed any efficiency expert were its various components, transforming what had begun as opportunistic crimes into a sophisticated criminal enterprise that generated enormous profits while maintaining an impeccable public reputation. The Richardson family had refined their methods over 18 years of practice into a complex organizational structure that maximized efficiency while minimizing risk. Had evolved the family's division of labor, Delivering inspiring sermons that drew new converts regularly while keeping existing members focused on heavenly rewards rather than earthly concerns, Samuel Richardson maintained his role as spiritual leader and public face of the community. Throughout Kentucky's religious communities, with ministers from other denominations frequently citing Pleasant Hill as an example of successful Christian living, his charismatic presence had become legendary. What amounted to a science of psychological manipulation had Martha Richardson developed. With the intensity of a naturalist observing specimens, studying each community member, had become so refined that the process typically took only 3 to 4 months to complete. Were her methods for breaking down individual resistance and rebuilding personalities according to family specifications, updating them regularly based on observations from her network of female relatives and informants. She maintained detailed psychological profiles on every member that generated multiple revenue streams. Had the community's expansion enabled more sophisticated criminal operations, generating enormous profits that never appeared in the books shown to members. Brother Ezekiel Richardson's agricultural operations now supplied produce to markets in Louisville, Lexington, and Cincinnati, provided labor costs that made Pleasant Hill farms impossibly profitable compared to conventional operations. Was his workforce of unpaid community members maintained through psychological coercion rather than physical restraint, producing pieces that were sold throughout the Ohio River Valley and marketed as authentic Shaker craftsmanship. Brother Jeremiah Richardson's furniture workshops had similarly expanded, but the labor was essentially slavery disguised as religious devotion. The quality remained high because Jeremiah genuinely understood woodworking. With profits flowing entirely to the Richardson family's private accounts, his workers put in 12 to 14-hour days producing furniture that sold for premium prices. How the family had begun selling community members to buyers who operated plantations and industrial facilities throughout the South and Midwest was the most insidious development. While explaining the mysterious disappearances that might otherwise have attracted unwanted attention, this human trafficking operation, coordinated primarily by Brother Isaiah during his seed business travels, provided the highest profit margins of any family enterprise. Followed coldly calculated criteria, the selection process for trafficking victims were prime candidates, as were individuals whose family connections made their continued presence at Pleasant Hill potentially problematic, younger members with valuable skills but dangerous independent tendencies. For workers who came with fabricated documentation proving their voluntary servitude, the buyers who believed they were purchasing indentured servants rather than free citizens paid substantial sums. The family specialist in breaking down new converts and identifying those suitable for different fates had Sister Rebecca Richardson become. Enabling her to categorize newcomers into groups was her psychological assessment process disguised as spiritual counseling, valuable long-term assets who would remain at Pleasant Hill, potential trafficking victims who could be sold for profit, and dangerous individuals who needed immediate elimination. Combining genuine spiritual guidance with systematic abuse that created powerful trauma bonds between victims and their abusers were Rebecca's methods. Then perverted these techniques to serve the family's criminal purposes. She had studied the conversion experiences of legitimate Shaker communities, while stripping away their connections to previous identities and relationships. Her sessions left converts psychologically dependent on her approval. Where the Richardson family controlled every source of knowledge and interpretation, the community's isolation had become both geographical and psychological, with members existing in a closed information environment. Members rarely encountered outsiders except during carefully supervised visits to nearby towns, located on thousands of acres of family-controlled land, who monitored all interactions and reported any conversations that suggested disloyalty. Even these excursions were managed by Richardson family members. That provided protection from official scrutiny. Had the family cultivated extensive relationships with local authorities, receiving regular donations to his campaign funds and personal accounts in exchange for his assumption that Pleasant Hill was a model religious community deserving protection rather than investigation. Sheriff William Morrison of Mercer County had become essentially a paid ally. Throughout the region's power structure, these relationships extended, who viewed Pleasant Hill as a valuable economic and spiritual asset to their communities. Brother Nathan Richardson's charm offensive had won allies among local merchants, politicians, and religious leaders that made local officials reluctant to investigate rumors or complaints. The community's legitimate business operations provided substantial tax revenue and employment opportunities, to include elaborate rituals and ceremonies that reinforced member dependency while identifying potential dissent. Had the psychological control mechanisms evolved Creating altered states of consciousness where critical thinking became impossible, Samuel Richardson's worship services combined authentic Shaker elements with subtle psychological manipulation, leaving participants emotionally drained and psychologically vulnerable to suggestion. These services often lasted for hours. Beyond spiritual guidance, evening confession sessions led by various Richardson family members served multiple purposes. They provided opportunities to identify members harboring doubts or resentments, created public pressure for conformity through shame and guilt, and enabled the family to gather intelligence about private conversations and relationships that might threaten their control. With different family members specializing in extracting specific types of information, the confession process had become increasingly elaborate. While Brother Caleb concentrated on practical concerns like escape plans or contact with outside authorities, Sister Rebecca focused on relationships and emotional attachments that might enable resistance, who might become problematic if they began asking questions. Sister Hannah monitored confessions for information about family members outside the community, whose decades of experience in manipulation guided their long-term planning. Mother Sarah Richardson, despite her apparent frailty, had emerged as the family's strategic mastermind. Among family members who referred to her privately as the General, in recognition of her tactical brilliance, had become legendary was her ability to appear harmless while orchestrating complex criminal operations. To every aspect of the operation, from the selection of new territories for expansion to the development of new techniques for psychological control, Sarah's influence extended, enabling her to predict how individuals would respond to various pressures and rewards. Was her understanding of human nature gained through 70 years of observing and manipulating others. From opportunistic theft into a sustainable business model that could theoretically continue indefinitely, her strategic vision had transformed the family's criminal enterprise. For maintaining security and preventing exposure had required increasingly sophisticated methods, the expansion of their operations that enabled coordination across their various enterprises while minimizing the risk of interception by hostile parties. The family had developed elaborate communication systems. They used coded language in their correspondence, maintained separate financial accounts for different operations, and created false identities that could be used if rapid escape became necessary. From an unexpected source came the beginning of the end for the Richardson family's 27-year reign of terror. The legitimate Shaker leadership in Ohio had their own success attracted attention. To evaluate Pleasant Hill for potential inclusion in their formal alliance of authenticated Shaker settlements, in late 1833, the Ohio Union of Shaker Communities decided to send Elder Joseph Mickham, one of their most experienced and respected leaders. Was not the typical visitor the Richardsons were accustomed to managing. Elder Mickham, who had spent 40 years in Shaker communities across New York, Ohio, and Pennsylvania, a genuine disciple of Mother and Lee's teachings. That made him nearly impossible to deceive. He possessed an intimate knowledge of proper Shaker practices, record-keeping, and community structure. To verify that Pleasant Hill truly followed authentic Shaker principles before recommending them for official recognition and inclusion in the Union's collective decision-making processes was his mission. About Pleasant Hill's spiritual achievements and economic success, the evaluation request had come after years of glowing reports. Their reputation for quality craftsmanship, and their apparent success in maintaining celibacy and communal property arrangements over more than 2 decades, the Ohio leadership had been impressed by accounts of the community's growth. Both an honor and a potentially devastating threat to the Richardson family's carefully constructed facade, the decision to send Mickham represented. Confident that his family's carefully constructed facade would fool another religious leader, Samuel Richardson initially welcomed the evaluation with apparent enthusiasm, including ministers from other denominations who had left Pleasant Hill convinced of its spiritual authenticity. After all, they had successfully deceived hundreds of visitors over the years, had given them confidence that they could control the process and manipulate Mickham's conclusions. The family's experience in managing inspections throughout the Richardson network, but Mickham's first requests immediately raised alarm bells. Who were content with guided tours and carefully staged demonstrations of community life. Unlike previous visitors, Mickham wanted to examine financial records going back to the community's founding in 1807. Without Richardson family supervision or preparation, he insisted on speaking privately with randomly selected members. He brought his own accounting ledgers and expected to reconcile Pleasant Hill's reported membership numbers with their consumption records, work output, and correspondence logs. Most troubling of all, during his first meeting with Samuel Richardson became clear the scope of Mickham's investigation. "Brother Samuel," Micam said in his quiet but authoritative voice, conducted in the community's main meeting hall before an audience of senior members, "the Ohio Union has developed standardized procedures for evaluating potential member communities. We'll need to review your membership rolls, financial records, correspondence files, and burial registers for the past 5 years. We'll also need to conduct private interviews with at least 50 members selected through random drawing." The first crack in his usually perfect composure, Samuel's response revealed. "Elder Micam, we are honored by your visit and eager to demonstrate our commitment to Mother N's teachings. However, our record-keeping follows Kentucky practices that may differ from Ohio standards. Perhaps we could arrange a more informal evaluation that better reflects our unique circumstances." Pleasant but firm, Micam's expression remained. "I appreciate your regional considerations, Brother Samuel, but the Union's standards apply equally to all communities regardless of location. Authentic Shaker practices are universal, not subject to regional variation. We'll begin with the membership rolls and burial registers tomorrow morning." Their voices hushed, but their panic evident to anyone who might have been listening. That evening, the Richardson family held an emergency meeting in Samuel's private quarters. Took charge of the strategy session with the authority of someone accustomed to managing crises, Mother Sarah Richardson, despite her apparent frailty. "This man knows things we can't fake," she whispered urgently. "He's asking for documentation we can't provide without exposing everything. We need to delay, deflect, and if necessary, eliminate the threat before he completes his investigation." The scope of their vulnerability, Brother Isaiah Richardson was the first to articulate. "He's asking for records going back 5 years, but our problems go back much further. The membership numbers alone will expose us. Our books show 400 members, but we've got maybe 250 actually living here. The burial registers are even worse. We've got graves for people who supposedly left for other communities." To their predicament, Sister Hannah Collins added another terrifying dimension. "He's already identified inconsistencies in the correspondence I've been maintaining with other communities. He knows Shaker writing conventions I never learned. And he's asking questions about Mother Lee's teachings that our people can't answer because they were never properly instructed." Only intensified his suspicions and strengthened his resolve to uncover the truth, the family's initial attempts to delay and deflect Micam's investigation. He pointed out that none of the buildings showed signs of weather damage when they claimed certain records were stored in a building that had been damaged by recent storms. From a complete membership list, when they suggested interviewing specific members who could vouch for community practices, he insisted on selecting interview subjects himself through random drawing. So effective at monitoring community members proved useless against an investigator who understood the importance of maintaining operational security, Brother Caleb Richardson's surveillance network. Conducted interviews in different locations, and seemed to possess an intuitive awareness of when he was being watched, Micam varied his routines. About authentic Shaker practices that made it impossible to maintain their deceptions, his questions during member interviews revealed a depth of knowledge. In ways that terrified the Richardson family, most dangerously, some of the community's surviving members began responding to Micam's genuine spiritual presence. Who had witnessed Brother Thomas Whitman's suspicious death over 20 years earlier, found herself drawn to Micam's obvious authenticity and began sharing her long-suppressed observations about members who had mysteriously disappeared, Sister Mary Caldwell. On community members was profound and immediate, the psychological effect of Micam's presence. They encountered someone whose spiritual authority didn't depend on fear, manipulation, or psychological abuse for the first time in decades. His gentle questions about their experiences, his obvious knowledge of authentic Shaker practices, and his genuine concern for their spiritual welfare created an atmosphere where long-buried doubts and memories began to surface. Found his workers becoming increasingly unproductive as they spent time talking with Micam about traditional Shaker craftsmanship techniques they had never been taught. Brother Jeremiah Richardson, whose furniture workshops provided crucial income for the family's operations. That made it obvious they weren't receiving proper instruction in authentic Shaker methods. The conversations revealed gaps in their knowledge. Began breaking down as female members started asking questions about Shaker practices they'd never heard of before Micam's arrival, Sister Rebecca Richardson's carefully controlled dormitory system. When compared to the obvious authenticity of their visitors' spiritual knowledge and gentle demeanor, her authority, so absolute for so many years, suddenly seemed questionable. When Micom requested access to the community cemetery for a private memorial service honoring departed members, the investigation took a decisive turn. But they also couldn't allow him to examine the burial grounds too closely without risking exposure of their crimes. The Richardson family couldn't refuse such a reasonable request without appearing suspicious. Hoping to control what he observed and limit his time among the graves, Brother Caleb volunteered to escort Micom to the cemetery. That had escaped casual observers for decades, but Micom's trained eye immediately noticed inconsistencies. And the condition of grave markers suggested many more interments than the documented deaths could account for. The burial patterns didn't match the death dates in official records. "Brother Caleb," Micom said quietly as they stood among the headstones, "I noticed some irregularities in your burial records. This grave marker indicates Brother William died in 1829, but your correspondence files show letters from him dated 1830. How do you explain this discrepancy?" That was beginning to infect the entire family. Caleb's response revealed the desperation. "Elder Micom, perhaps there was an error in our record keeping. Our sister Patience maintains extensive files, but even the most careful record keeper can make mistakes when dealing with so many community members over so many years." But skeptical, Micom's expression remained thoughtful. "I understand that record keeping can be challenging, but Shaker communities traditionally maintain extremely accurate documentation of deaths and departures. The inconsistencies I'm observing suggest systematic problems rather than occasional errors. That would expose the full scope of the Richardson family's crimes and bring their 27-year reign of terror to an end." That night, Micom made a discovery. On the night of March 15, 1834, Elder Micom made a discovery that would expose the full scope of the Richardson family's 27-year reign of terror. Due to his growing suspicions about the discrepancies he had uncovered during 3 weeks of investigation, he decided to examine the community's cemetery by moonlight, hoping to reconcile burial records with actual grave sites without Richardson family supervision. Unable to sleep. That told two completely different stories was a graveyard. What he found, containing approximately 40 graves with proper headstones dating from 1807 to 1834, was the official cemetery maintained for visitors and official inspections. And arranged in neat rows that suggested careful planning and maintenance. The markers were well crafted, obviously expensive. Sharpened by decades of experience managing authentic Shaker communities, noticed inconsistencies in the ground itself that revealed a far more sinister reality, but Micom's trained eye. And variations in soil color that suggested many more burials than the headstones indicated. Areas throughout the cemetery showed subtle depressions, forming barely perceptible indentations that would escape casual observation, but were obvious to someone who understood how burial grounds evolved over time. The earth in these unmarked sections had been disturbed and allowed to settle. Also revealed the truth, the vegetation patterns, indicating soil that had been repeatedly disturbed and replaced. Certain areas supported different plant growth than others. When he examined the dated graves more carefully, Micom realized that many of the supposed death dates corresponded exactly with his list of members who had allegedly left Pleasant Hill to found new communities or visit distant relatives. More chilling still, on the same day they were reported to have departed for Ohio or Tennessee. The timeline was impossible. How could someone die and be buried at Pleasant Hill? That it demonstrated years of careful planning. His systematic examination of each grave marker revealed a pattern of deception so elaborate. Next to those who had allegedly left for missionary work in distant territories were buried members who had supposedly died of natural causes. That coincided perfectly with moments when the community faced potential exposure or internal resistance. The dates formed a chronicle of systematic elimination. By Sister Mary Caldwell, who had been watching from her dormitory window and recognized an opportunity to finally reveal the truth she had carried for over 20 years, Micom's investigation was interrupted. She approached the cemetery with the desperate courage of someone who knew this might be her only chance to expose the horrors she had witnessed, moving silently through the darkness. She whispered urgently as she approached his lantern-lit figure among the gravestones, "Elder Micom, God has sent you to reveal the truth we've been too terrified to speak. What you're seeing here is only a small part of what the Richardson family has done to this community." Conducted in hushed tones among the silent graves, Mary revealed the horrifying truth she had carried in terrified silence for decades in a conversation. Her voice shaking with suppressed terror and long-awaited relief. "I've seen them bury people in the middle of the night," she said. They've been systematically murdering anyone who threatens their power or questions their authority. The Richardson family, they don't just control this community. Delivered in broken whispers as they crouched between headstones to avoid detection, painted a picture of systematic elimination that went far beyond occasional murders to maintain control. Mary's testimony, where members who questioned finances, expressed homesickness,